Time now for focus and to Syria, which despite the terrible human cost, the civil war there proving an opportunity for some. In the far northeast of the country, Kurds and the Syriac Christian community have begun carving out autonomous regions for themselves. With the regime under attack on many fronts and the advance of the Islamic State organisation, a space has opened up for the Kurds and Christians who are also fighting the jihadists. Our team met one of the Syriac fighters who left his life in Switzerland to defend his community's heritage and liberty. This report by Sébastien Bouillet and Luke Brown.
Fighting for his people's freedom. For 2 years, Johan Kozar has led a Christian militia group against the rise of the Islamic State organisation. Aided by Kurdish forces, Johan's fighters have won back 20 villages from Islamist extremists in Jazeera province.
Over there's the River Gabor. After that, it's the Islamic State organisation. There are a lot of risks because you can see the distance. It's about 200 or 300 metres. If there were a sniper over there, he could shoot us very easily.
Johan is a Syriac from the region's ancient Christian population, but he comes from Switzerland and was an instructor in the Swiss army. Now he trains both Christians and Muslims.
I want to show that we have no problem with living and fighting side by side.
It's not a Christian jihad, it's a war for human rights, for the rights of a people. It's a people's war.
Switzerland does not allow its citizens to fight for another army. Johan risks 3 years imprisonment if he returns, a small price to pay for the survival of the Syriac Christian community.
Nobody will give you your rights. You're the one who has to earn them. That's why we're fighting, to defend our ethnic rights, our language, our history, our land and our identity.
This is Hasakeh, a strategically important town in the south of the region that the Syriacs and the Kurds reconquered 2 months ago. The jihadist threat remains high, with Islamist forces still operational in the region.
There are still a lot of people belonging to the Islamic State organisation in town.
For the Syriacs, just like the Kurds and the government forces, the main threat remains the Islamic State organisation. Here in Hasakeh, the regime's police is still present, but they're in a minority and have little authority over the militia fighters. The Syriac police is known as the Sutoro. Allied with the Kurds, it protects the Christian population from Islamist attacks. Its force of 700 men and women shares control of Hasakeh with the regime's loyalist police.
We have our sectors and they have theirs. They have no right to come into ours and vice versa, but we do communicate with each other.
The regime has no right to come here because it does not defend anything. It doesn't do anything. As long as it's present, our people can't have their own rights.
In the midst of this uneasy truce and seeming stability, a temporary government has been created. It was formed a year ago when the regime, weakened by the war, left the region to manage alone. It uses oil revenues to finance the militias. The headquarters of this new administration is in Kamishli, a town in the north of Jazeera, close to the Turkish border.
Organization, a building of the new government.
And it's dangerous.
Yes, from bombing. They are target now.
Facing the threat of Islamist retaliation means the new government building is kept under tight surveillance. Inside we meet 2 leaders of the new government, a Kurd and a Syriac.
We have joined up, Kurds, Arabs and Syriacs, and we have formed a committee so that each party is represented. Our local government is in charge of the executive.
Participating in this power-sharing government is a unique opportunity for the Syriac minority, which only represents a quarter of the population of Jazeera.
Our political project is essential because it alone can enable Syriacs to continue to live according to their traditions, to continue to develop and especially to keep their land.
The 2 men promised that democratic elections will be held in the next few months. Back at the front line, Johan takes us to a village a short distance from Ras Al Ain, where the tension remains high.
Here there was a suicide attack 2 weeks ago. He came past here and blew himself up with a car. That's why they've narrowed the road.
The Islamic State organization positions are just a few hundred meters away. The jihadists often attack under cover of darkness, forcing our team to move on as night falls, making sure to not be seen by the enemy.
Any light can be fatal because we're not far from the Islamic State organization. You see those lights over there? That's them.
As gunfire rings out nearby, through the night the militia keeps up its watch over this village. For the Christian Syriacs, the civil war has mutated into a fight for survival.
We're not an ordinary military force, we're a people's military force. It's the people who've decided to fight. That's why there aren't any rules here. The difference between us and the Islamic State organization is that with us, we're fighting for democracy and to live in freedom.
Johan wants freedom for Kurdistan once Jazeera has been won back. But there is little chance that the regime or the Islamic groups will give up their fight for the region's resources. In a deeply fractured region, that means hopes of peace for the Syriac Christians remain a distant prospect.
With more, I'm joined by Myriam Benrad, who's a Middle East Research Fellow at Sciences Po University here in Paris. Thanks very much for talking to us. How do you see things developing for Christians and Kurds in Syria?
Well, there was a clear defeat of the Islamic State, of the jihadists, in the city of Kobani, which was quite symbolic, since it's the first defeat of such magnitude for the jihadist organization. Yet, I think it's important to recall, as is also shown in your documentary, that the Islamic State is not fully defeated, that the group continues to control vast regions, including Kurdish ones along the border, and is also still a significant threat against the Christian population and other minorities in the region. And we're seeing very clearly with the last video and the last operations elsewhere in Syria and also in Iraq that there's that the group is still in a logic of excessive violence, and that it's not going to give up on its goal to conquer more territory and recruit more men into its ranks and ignite a real full-blown conflict for the time being.
And what about the ongoing search for a Kurdish homeland, not just in Syria but elsewhere?
Well, I think it's clearly there's clearly a pattern or request for autonomy coming from the Kurds. It's already the case in Iraq, where the Kurds enjoy autonomy. They enjoyed this autonomy for years. And there's clearly now a quest from Syrian Kurds for such autonomy, given the impasse in the country, the fact that the regime does not represent any credible alternative, and that in parallel, as I said, the insurgency, the armed opposition is now almost entirely controlled by the Islamic State, which basically gives no other solution to the Kurds than, as I said, looking for their own autonomy. And they're clearly playing this card now at the regional level, especially in Syria, in the current context of impasse, as I said.
Syria at the moment obviously is in a terrible state. A lot of groups competing there, aside from the fight in between Bashar al-Assad's government and the Islamic State organisation. What do you see any kind of eventual settlement looking like?
Well, I think clearly there will be no short-term settlement of this crisis. The problem being that the moderate armed opposition has been almost entirely suppressed under the attacks of both the regimes, the al-Assad regime and the Islamic State, which both have a common interest in eliminating these moderates, the ones who could have embodied a transition. So for the time being, unfortunately, I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I don't see any settlement. And the problem is that now you will find some circles, especially in the West, somehow thinking that Assad could be the alternative given the impasse. But I think it's important to underline that Assad himself has played the card of the most radical Islamists, again, to suppress the opposition, and that in no way this regime can embody any future for Syria. So unfortunately, I think we are more heading towards, as I said, a full-blown lasting conflict. And the challenge is clearly set. How can the West help reconstitute an opposition, including an armed opposition that is moderate and that can lead to an acceptable transition in this country? But for the time being, it's very unlikely.
Miriam Benrad, thank you very much for joining us. And that's it for this edition of Focus.